Our governance, law, and economics lecture series is designed to highlight those three institutions that need to work together to maintain a free civil society. Those institutions are good governance, the rule of law, and market institutions. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Jeanie Theis. Dr. Theis has over 25 years of professional experience in criminal justice. She holds a PhD in political science with an emphasis on crime control policy, and she has a master's degree in psychology and was a prison psychologist for 9 years, directing Missouri State Sex Offenders Program. Dr. Theis joined Lindenwood University in 2007 and is currently a professor of public affairs and administration. From 2012 to 2016, she was the Dean for Institutional Research, overseeing the university's assessment process. Dr. Theis has consulted for national, state, and local agencies. Her areas of expertise include program and policy development and evaluation, offender risk assessment, criminal thinking errors, and treatment of sex offenders and antisocial offenders. She's conducted numerous training workshops and has made presentations for corrections staff, juvenile officers, probation and parole officers, police, prosecutors, and treatment professionals. Dr. Theis was recently appointed to the Governor's Child Abuse and Neglect Review Board in Missouri. She is also a former member of the St. Charles Probation and Parole Citizens Advisory Board and the governing board for the Women's Safe House in St. Louis, Missouri. She has served on a legislative task force to develop policies for sex offender management and numerous task forces and committees. She's published articles on programs for high-risk youth, corrections and budgeting, drug courts, child welfare initiatives, and the impact of prisons on host communities. Tonight, she's going to share with us the challenges of implementing evidence-based criminal justice reform. So if you would, please join me in providing a warm ESU welcome to Dr. Jeanie Theis.
So I'm going to try to make this work without the microphone. Back of the room, are you good? You okay with that? Okay. So as Dr. Jeanie said, I'm going to be talking about the state of knowledge regarding what works in criminal justice, particularly to corrections, and evidence-based practices. And by practices, I mean the things we do in interacting with offenders that are intended to produce change, the programs, the policies, the initiatives around producing change. We talk about what we should do in corrections. It tends to divide along ideological lines. Support for punitive versus rehabilitation policies. The idea of getting tougher on crime or being more compassionate and softer on criminals tends to break down along partisan lines. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is trying to set aside those kind of preconceived ideas and values that may influence the way we perceive what's effective and what we should do, and to think simply in terms of what do we know that works? What does science tell us, social science, but form of science, what does it tell us about what's good policy and practice? So let me kind of get a feel for the audience. We have anybody here who is a criminal justice major, has some coursework in criminal justice? Okay. So some kind of baseline knowledge. I wasn't sure how much time to spend on defining some of the terms and things, but thanks, that's helpful. Since I've been working the field, I've been very heartened and excited to see the tremendous explosion in research and knowledge about best practices, what works, evidence-based programming. But I've also been very disappointed and discouraged to see how uneven and inadequate the application is done. In other words, the extent to which prisons, jails, and probation and parole agencies pick up on these ideas and implement those ideas and use those and only those in their work with offenders. So I'm going to talk today about the status of the knowledge and then where the gaps are, what those gaps are, why we have these pronounced gaps, and some ways to bridge it. My ideas as well as some things, some initiatives that are going on that can help bridge those gaps. So let's define some things. We talk about corrections. I'm talking about people from the point of sentencing through release from supervision. Supervision means probation and parole. I think most people know probation is it's an alternative. It's not an alternative. It's a sentence you get that's suspended. So it's instead of going to prison, the 5-year suspended sentence if you're going to spend that complying with some conditions under the supervision of a probation officer. And then parole actually really looks the same in terms of how it's implemented, but it's the population of people who have left prison and are under supervision. Once people have completed that, we say that the corrections agency intervention is done. So point of sentencing through exit from supervision. Most of what happens in corrections happens at the state level. The vast majority of crimes, including violent crimes, are state crimes. Federal prisons tend to be a little over half drug offenders, and then we have like a lot of white-collar fraud, those types of offenses. Most crime that we think about is state-level crime. So these are just some figures from the 2016 census. 2017 figures aren't complete, that are compiled. And you can see the jails is a smaller percentage. Jails are for two purposes, primarily pretrial detainees, so people who either can't make bond or they are seen as too great a risk to be released in society. So they're not yet found to be guilty, which is important because they're innocent and proven guilty. And in terms of what kind of interventions we can compel them to do, there's some limits because they're not yet sentenced. We can't yet say they are these types of offenders. And jails also house people who are doing very short sentences. Typically 1 year. Some counties may hold people as long as 2 years because of overcrowding in the states. You can see the smaller percentage of people in federal prisons, and this graph actually includes people in our youth system as well. Okay, so there's a kind of clearing a breakdown of where people are. So most people, over half, and this is representative again of the 2016 data, but this would be pretty representative of kind of any given year. Over half of the people under criminal justice supervision are on probation, smaller percent in our prisons, and then the jail holders. So when I talk about corrections practice, I'm talking about these again, but with a stronger emphasis on people in the state system, be that the state prisons or the state probation and parole agencies. So what is it we want when we talk about practice working? What does working mean? What is it we want our correction system to do? And these are all not necessarily mutually exclusive, but these are some of the different goals, the different expectations of the system. We want it to deter. There's a lot of emphasis people put on the deterrent value. They believe longer sentences. People often believe harsher prisons are going to result in greater deterrence. Therefore, people are less likely to recidivate. Actually, the research says otherwise, that the longer sentences and harsher prison conditions either don't affect recidivism or they have what's called an iatrogenic effect. They affect it in the wrong direction. They lead to greater levels of recidivism than we would see of similarly situated offenders who serve shorter sentences or serve it under less harsh conditions. Say prisons that do 23/7 lockdown, which is actually very uncommon. For the most part, in a prison environment, you're spending most of your day out of your cell, working and probably going to school. Prisons that have maximum security 23/7, because they allow an hour for showers and recreation, have been found to produce higher levels of recidivism in the offenders returning to the community. And again, this is when you compare them with offenders who have similar offenses, similar backgrounds. But deterrence is still very much a valued part of our system. Rehabilitation support has been uneven throughout time. It was kind of the MO in the 60s and 70s, the idea of our prisons were overcrowded. They were kind of colleges for crime, factories, warehouses, and there was increased emphasis on rehabilitation that period. But we also saw a concurrent rise in crime that was perceived as being related to lax practices. The extent to which it was, we don't really know. What we do know is the crime increases we saw starting in the early 60s through the late 80s were largely a product of the demographics. So because of the baby boomers, we had a greater percentage of people who were within their peak offending years, which is actually like 15 to late 20s. If you're going to commit a crime, you can probably do it best. We had a greater percentage of the population in those years, and so we saw more crime. And this has been a trend that has been evident at other points in history. Correctional policies being not tough enough may have been a factor. There may have been other things. We had the countercultural movement, a lot of kind of political turmoil. But a lot of it was mistakenly attributed to just the fact that we were too lax. So the pendulum went the other way, and we moved into a kind of post-rehabilitation society that really picked up speed in the 1980s through the early 2000s. And I'll show you some graphs to kind of show the odd trends in how crime was starting to change, yet we were continuing to incarcerate more and more people. And by the way, if you haven't heard this figure or this fact before, the United States incarcerates more people than anybody in the world. And that is not because, as people mistakenly assume, we have the most crime. We don't. We have higher incarceration rates, largely for reasons that have to do with the politics and kind of how we're entrenched, how we kind of have this idea of this is how we've always done it. Punishment, retribution, accountability, a little bit different than just deterrent. It's the idea that even if a punishment didn't deter, people perceive it as important. This gets into the kind of moral ideas and values because they believe we should be held accountable for wrongdoing. We hurt somebody, we violate the social contract, take a life. That's not something that should go unnoticed. People believe actually in a civil society that part of what we owe is to provide that retribution on behalf of one another. So retribution, people can cling to that value even in the absence of any impact. If they say, I don't care if it deters or not, sometimes you just have to punish people in a way to hold them accountable. And that's a personal value. It's hard to refute with data whether or not that's what our system should be doing. Restorative justice is a relatively new movement, although maybe it's just the name that's new. But it's the idea of trying to patch up and make amends to society for the behavior that we've done. So rather than isolating people and punishing on the ideas, how do we bring them back in the fold here, but make them do certain things, compel them to do things that repair the damage. And this works pretty well, like the community level, say with youth crime, maybe kids vandalize the neighborhood, and rather than getting a formal sanction, they're required to go clean up the vandalism. They're required to go and paint over the graffiti, that sort of thing. It also happens in a more indirect sense. Most states have some sort of victim compensation law. You commit certain crimes against persons, and you have an automatic fine tacked on your sentence where you have to pay so much into a central account that victims can then tap into if they need money to repair damage to their homes, if they need money for counseling, etc. So the restorative justice movement has kind of gained some traction over the last 50 years or so, is one of the aims of corrections. And finally, it's just incapacitate, which may be the one that our system so far just seems to do the best, which is just keep people contained for the period of time that they're expected. We don't have a lot of prison breaks. We don't have a lot of crimes that happen as a result of that, people getting out of the community from prison. So in particular, our prison system may just do that the best. They keep people there, and they try to contain the amount of crimes they can commit while they're there. But it's only a short-term goal. For reasons I'll show you in a minute. It's not enough to say, well, we keep people in prison, they don't hurt anybody while we're there, isn't that what it should do? The answer is no. Eventually, everybody's coming back. About 95% of prisoners eventually will return to society. It's not the end of the road. The only people who are staying are those who are doing life without parole, those who will be put to death, which your state doesn't have capital punishment, or those people who end up dying in prison of either natural causes, suicide, or victims of homicide. Everybody else at some point is coming back to our community. So it's not enough to incapacitate them. It's not enough to think we sent them away and so these are some figures on recidivism, because when we say what works, we're really talking about this. Do they get in trouble again? I mean, that's really the end measure we need to think about. Do they come out after they have been in prison, or after they have gone through this program, or been on house arrest, supervision? Are they any different? That's what works is about. It's asking that question. So usually we see within 3 years people getting rearrested. About 2/3, about 3/4 are rearrested within 5 years. Now you can see different figures from these. These are the kind of the mean estimates over a number of studies, because depending on how the study defines a recidivism, for instance, if they look at rearrests for felonies only, if they look at rearrests for perhaps a violation of a technical condition of parole results in rearrest, it's going to look higher. Some studies may only be able to track offenders within a limited jurisdiction. So they're not necessarily able to tap a national database, but they can look at, do the Missouri offenders with every offender in Missouri. That's why you're going to see different figures, but it's always going to be within this thing. It's kind of 2/3 to 3/4 are getting in trouble again. So according to that, does it seem the system overall works in reducing recidivism? Are those good? Anybody comfortable with that and say, yeah, about 3/4 of them failure? No, of course not. The definitions of recidivism varies, I said, across studies. Some offense types have higher recidivism rates than others. Which types of offenses do you think, or do you know, have the highest recidivism rate?
Drug use? Drug use?
Drug use, it does, but not necessarily in terms of that's the rearrest official offense, but it plays a role. Anybody else want to hazard another? Theft, okay. Specifically burglary and robbery, which is, so theft is I come in, you take my laptop. Burglary is you take it from, you violate, you trespass into a place, you take it from my home or office, and then robbery is you take it from the person. So burglary and robbery have the highest recidivism rates, and often those are entwined with people's addiction. So that plays a role, but it's not necessarily the rearrest on that. So some have higher recidivism rate or more concerning than others. Murder has a low recidivism rate, and it's not because what people think is, well, because they never get out, the murderers do get out. There's kind of different dynamics at play that result in lower recidivism there. So let's define the evidence-based practice. What am I talking about? Evidence-based practice is practice that has been researched through the most rigorous methods that are available to social scientists. The best way we can design the study in the real world, because the world isn't a laboratory, the biggest sample we can get, as many times as we can repeat that study and find it holds true from this state to that state, and now and 5 years later, the higher the level of integrity that program has, the better, the more confident we can be in saying that something works. So there's this huge body of literature, as I said, that's been building that is showing some things work really well with some groups of offenders, not with everybody, and some things don't work at all. They just are just a complete waste of our tax dollars. And some things are working in the other direction. They're increasing recidivism rate. And by things, again, I mean practices, programs, interventions, the way we're trying to change that behavior. So the idea is that of evidence-based research is we're trying to improve agency outcomes and community safety by applying this to change in the system, by trying to bridge, here's the knowledge to here's what we should be doing with it. And it requires collaboration of research and practitioners in order to be effective. I'm going to talk some about what the challenges are with that. The terms best practices and what works are often used interchangeably, and that's not just in criminal justice, that's in education, virtually any kind of public policy area. We talk about the what works, the best practices. Evidence-based is usually used specifically to talk about that stuff that has been, again, held to the highest degree of rigor in the research and has been peer-reviewed and generally accepted to say this meets the standards of something that is known to be effective and therefore is worth continuing and replicating. Okay. And this slide, I'm sorry, is a little hard to read, but I like the graphic and kept trying to play with the fuzziness on it. But these are the general principles. I'll try, if I can get it up, I'm going to show you a website that kind of lists some of the programs and how they rate them. There's different rating systems that various government agencies and think tanks assign to a program that puts it at a level relative to others in terms of is it really effective, is it promising, is it just not there at all. But these are the general principles. So let's start with this risk need, assess actuarial risk. If you pay car insurance here and you're a male, you probably pay more car insurance than a woman in this room who's the same age as you and has the same driving record. Why? If you do, why?
Because they found that men are apparently more like this.
Yeah. Well, they are. That's evidence-based. Yeah. But maybe it's not fair if you're a really good driver. But that's an actuarial method. It's based on the idea that people in this class of people who have these characteristics, we will assume will behave like the other people in that class of risk that we've established some outcomes on. So if we know that 18 to 25-year-old males have higher rates of collisions, then we apply that data to all the 18 to 25-year-olds and we penalize them accordingly. So the same can go with offenders. There's vast differences in types of offenders in terms of age and mental health and offense backgrounds, economic class. So one way we try to kind of collapse those differences is through risk methods. What do we know about people who committed their first crime at age 13 and who have only property but no violent offenses and who have addiction and a poorly functioning family? Those are the typical type of items that might be on a risk scale, and we can look at that and say, well, he went out and reoffended and he's got that same profile, therefore we can treat him the same in terms of higher risk. So if we recognize you were likely to reoffend, we haven't tracked your outcomes, we can assign this kind of sanctions that would mitigate that risk based on that. And that should be happening in the jails and probation agencies and in corrections. It should be standard, it should be routine, and it should be repeated. It is, for the most part, happening, but it's very uneven in terms of what that means. I've worked with agencies that fill out these lengthy, they send officers to a week-long training, fill out these lengthy surveys, come up with the score, and they put it in a database, and nobody ever thinks about it again. And in the better system, which I've also seen, is where that score is specifically tied to what you're going to do with that offender, the level of supervision. Are you going to put him on house arrest? Are you going to recommend that he goes to prison when you write the report to the judge, et cetera? The next thing is enhanced intrinsic motivation. So criminal justice policy is one area of policy where the primary clients are all of us, but the direct recipients of these evidence-based practices are often resistant. But there's some established techniques that have been shown to increase the willingness to participate in various types of interventions. Something called motivational interviewing. It's like a whole week-long class in itself, but if you're interested, you can look that up. It's evidence-based. It's been shown to work to get offenders to go along with certain programs and things they might otherwise have been resistant to. And it's basically training probation, parole, correction officers, caseworkers, a certain style of dialoguing and communicating with offenders. Target intervention, meaning that the interventions match what's known to be wrong with the offenders in terms of what's called criminogenic risk factors. The best programs and interventions target criminogenic risk, meaning that there's certain things we know lead people to commit crime. What do you think some of those are? What would be a risk factor if it's in your life? You're more likely to commit crime. Well, addiction. Just kind of the
Scarcity of resources.
Scarcity of resources. So not exactly just poverty, but how the scarcity of resources affected the family's ability to raise a child in a way that's going to encourage them to make the right decision. So it's kind of the strain that it puts on the family and the overall functioning and supervision levels of the family. It's like single parent families, single moms tend to have a lot of kids who get into trouble, not so much because there's anything inherently wrong with being a single parent, but it strains your ability to supervise your kids adequately and things. So targeting those interventions, the research says we've got to hit 5 or 6 of them in order for it to be effective. If we just hit 2 or 3, we're wasting our time. And many programs target things that have nothing to do with criminogenic factors. So self-esteem, there's this kind of inherent belief a lot of people have, well, I know when I'm not feeling good about myself, I make bad decisions. If we can raise offenders' self-esteem, we can improve their decision-making. Self-esteem is one of those, self-esteem-based interventions are one of those types that either have no effect, they're wasting everybody's time, or they have the wrong effect. They produce the outcomes that we don't want, increase recidivism. And then you train the people who are going to be implementing these. You increase positive reinforcement, both to the staff for implementing these things, reward people who engage in evidence-based practice, and to the offenders who are using contingency management, offenders who are responding like you want. And then you engage in this kind of involving the entire community and collaboration of any relevant agencies. And then these things on the outer rim here, that's just talking about keep the research going, keep learning what this change is doing, and keep evaluating and modifying and tweaking accordingly. So this is a website. I'm not going to take the time to go out to it because I think it's going to take away from time, but if you're interested afterwards, if you want my slides, come and get my business card. I'm happy to send them to you. But these are some of these, as I said, these abundant resources out there that list all these programs that work. They describe their ranking system, and they assign like a score saying like, this thing, family functional therapy for you, gets a 4, and here's why it gets a 4. And they describe the body of research on it very briefly. It's very user-friendly. And they explain what the program in essence does and what kind of resources would be needed to implement it. You know, you need to send your staff to training for a week, etc. And so that's what all of these are. I think I had a youth one up there. These are all at the adult level, and that first one actually takes you out to an example of a program that is rated well. So all these use a little bit of ranking systems, but it's the same idea. The better the research that went into it, and the better the outcomes, the higher the ranking that's going to get. And then they look at the program components. Does it do those things on that wheel that we just saw? Why should we care? Like I said, 95% of incarcerated people return to society. And I put this slide up here because when I teach corrections, students often say, why should we care about what happens to people in prison? So even if we don't want to get a discussion about just kind of caring for our fellow citizens and empathy and things, you could say, well, sooner or later they're coming back. They're all going to be out here. Anybody ever check the sex offender registry for your address? And were you terrified? Go do it. My students are always shocked. I'll say, give me your address, and we'll plug some kid's address, and I'll say, how many sex offenders think live within 5 miles of Cohen? And they'll say, oh, I don't know, 7, 30, you know. Nobody ever gets the number as near as high as it is. So one of the most kind of fear types of offenders, they're out there amongst us, they're living around us. It's a lot of issues I have with sex offender registries. But if you don't believe that offenders are in your midst and that you're somehow safely separated from them, that's a little activity. You'll check out the Kansas Sex Offender Registry or your home state. It's on a public website somewhere. So this is your tax dollars at work. We should care because we should care about good governance. We should care about whether we're doing things like sending offenders through self-esteem class, which takes some sort of resources. And it also takes away, there's this idea of opportunity cost. The things that we're doing that are wasting time could be spent doing something better. We could spend that staff time, which is a resource, that room at the prison where they hold the groups that teach the self-esteem, that could be put to use to do something that's more meaningful, and those tax dollars can be shifted to something that's meaningful. When I start working with an agency and start talking to them about, let's talk about getting more evidence-based practices, they say, well, we don't have any money. And what I say is, yeah, but like 40% of what you're doing is not evidence-based. So that's where the money is. Let's move things around. And then there's this idea that, I find when I talk to agencies, they say, well, some people do evidence-based stuff, and we let the officers, probation officers, caseworkers, decide who gets those programs. I said, well, there's an issue of fairness here. Because if there's something that could work to change you, and to change you, but I'm a caseworker that knows about it and think it's good, and you get to go, but you go sit in self-esteem classes, there's some issues of fairness and justice. We had an opportunity to change everybody, and we differentially handed out that opportunity. And then, of course, this public safety can be compromised if we're doing things that are just worth their time. So these are just some stats showing you what the public thinks about the criminal justice system. Goes back about 7 years. You can see, just taking a look at that column, most people don't have a great deal of confidence, and the highest numbers come in when people kind of have some. And this is everything from policing through courts and corrections. These are Gallup polls, by the way, this little series of polls. This one is interesting. As you can see from this column, it's tracking the same point in time over a 7-year, 6-year period. Most people believe that crime has gone up since the year before. This is a consistent pattern. You can go back 20 years and you will see consistently when you ask people, do we have more crime than we had last year? Do we have more crime than we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago? You're going to see most people say yes. What's the reality? Do we have more crime today than we had 10 years ago? No? Well, that's good. Okay, you guys are in the poll. 20 years ago. So, no. And let me show you that crime has actually been going down since it peaked in the late 1980s. And then we say, is the country doing enough? Are we too tough? And here again you see that aligns with the idea. That's why that's important. To know that people think we have more crime, that corresponds to the idea. Therefore, we got to get tougher. Not we got to do what works. We got to examine the science and see what's effective. We just got to get tougher. We got to get stricter. So here's crime rates as they have fallen. These are by 100,000 residents from the FBI's UCR, Uniform Crime Statistics. These were compiled by the Pew Research Center. You can see violent crime, very nice, right? And the reason they used 93 was, I said it peaked in 88. It went down, but then there was this little blip in the early 90s where it zigzagged up again. Anybody know what happened there? 93, around that time? It was the crack cocaine epidemic. And there's been some really rigorous research that has very specifically tied the flow of crack into communities to this uptick in crime. So the crack thing kind of wigged everybody out for a while, but then crime started going down, down, down. But look over there with this one, and here's where it starts going down. but look what's happening. This is incarceration rate. We continue to incarcerate people. So crime's going this way, incarceration's going up. And some people say, okay, well, it's cause and effect. We're locking up more people, that's why crime is going down. Well, some economists did a study where they broke out the state's differential rates of starting to scale back their prison population, starting to use less fixed sentences, less mandatory sentences, which means you got to be there 15 years or whatever, and doing more forms of early release. And what they found is the states that saw the biggest decline in prison populations saw the biggest declines in crime. As they started letting more people out of prison, they started seeing bigger drops in crime. And it wasn't that the prisoners were coming out and they got safer, it was really that those things weren't related. Whereas people thought they were. We locked them up and it'd go away. Yeah?
Is that because of the school to prison pipeline system that kind of is
Yeah.
in place?
Yeah, this idea of you're the troubled child in school.
Yeah.
There's some wonderful graphics that are put together where it starts with a little school bus and then it ends with people behind bars. You start with the troubled child in school, you start labeling them, or they're in the substandard school districts and they don't have the opportunity, and they are elevated people going to, straight to prison. So yeah, it's kind of the people who are in the system are part of this kind of vicious cycle of things. So what happens with misinformation? Well, the public support, when we think crime is bad and we think we don't know what works and we think we need to just get tougher, we will clamor for our leaders to support those types of policies. And then sometimes that perpetuates misinformation. They tell us things that are incorrect. As a criminologist, I hear people all the time who purport to be experts on the things they're talking about, and they're experts about something in criminal justice, but not usually about statistics about what works. I invited a prosecutor, elected prosecutor from my home county, to a book discussion group where we read like crime books in this discussion group. And I invited him through a friend, and I had asked him just to get up and he kind of speak about what he did and his role as prosecutor. He was like an 8-year, it was like his second term. And he somehow got onto sex offenders, and somebody said, well, what do you think about sex offenders? Coming back Saturday, and he said, do you know the recidivism rate on sex offenders? He said, no. He said, 100%. It is 100%, ladies and gentlemen. It's completely false. The highest estimate suggests it's 34%. It's usually between 18 and 34. And that range is there because sex offenders, it's a big range, but a lot of sex offending goes unreported. But from a variety of studies, we know it's nowhere near, it doesn't approach 100%. Later, when I had drinks afterwards with the ladies in my discussion group, I said, you guys know that was wrong. What he said, I was the director of sex offender program. And they said, well, Jeanie, maybe you're a little biased then. He would know. He's a prosecutor. But I said, how would a prosecutor know? Prosecutors don't track recidivism. That's not what they do. So they perpetuate that, and then they were saying, you know what, we need these registries. We need more stuff that locks over. So we get lost opportunity costs, our tax dollars going down the drain, and then kind of like the school pipeline, that revolving door thing. People just keep coming back, and that makes us reinforce, like, well, they're never going to make it, so we might as well just keep getting tougher. So why is it so politicized and misrepresented? Why is it so misrepresented? It's highly politicized, and it's very emotionally charged. It's very difficult for politicians to come out as soft on crime when symbols of crime are used to drive the policy discussion. Think about the Jacob Wetterling laws and the Megan Cantor laws. You know what those are? That's the sex offender registry and sex offender notification laws. And they both came about from horrific cases in which a child was abducted and murdered. They actually, Jacob Wetterling disappeared in like the late 1980s. They didn't even find his body a couple of years ago. The missing child, found murdered. Megan Cantor went outside to play with a puppy and went missing, and she was found within minutes to have been murdered by a convicted sex offender that her mom didn't know lived in the neighborhood. Nobody wants to be against those registries when we give those symbols associated with it. And there's some things about the registry that may have value. By and large, they're one of these waste of our resources. What are we doing with those if they're not really accomplishing anything? Yet the emotions that go along, the beliefs about punishment are very strong, and they propel our politicians, and in turn our politicians feed us what they think we want. And citizens' victims' preferences for dealing with crime should matter. If people believe that retribution has some value and accountability, should we deny that in a democratic society? I believe we should do what works and what is the best use of our tax dollars and involves the most limited government intrusion. But it's hard to deny the idea that if we want certain things and we're part of we participate in society, why can't we demand that? Why can't we ask for that? The problem is, though, a lot of what people expect when they ask for tougher policies is really not just retribution. They believe it's going to result in deterrence. They believe that's going to result in decreased recidivism, whereas it doesn't. So I know this wasn't it's not the corrections program, it's a prevention program. How many of you guys went through this in school? DARE, okay. So DARE I use because it checks all the boxes in terms of what's bad about a program. So DARE has something like 1 million plus children in the United States have participated, over 2 million worldwide. It's like in 54 countries, and the last kind of nationwide survey, which was 2016, said it was in 75% of schools still. Despite the fact that we've known since like late 90s, early 2000s, is it doesn't work, okay? It doesn't work because it really seems to just be concerned with short-term outcomes. The people who work in DARE tend to be very attached to it. It feels good. It was started by Chief Daryl Gates in LA in the early 1980s. And it felt good to say, I care about drugs, we're going to put something in the school, and we're going to turn you little children away from drugs. My son wrote the most adorable essay when he got out of DARE. It had something to do with his macaroni and cheese recipe and why he would never use drugs. It was very moving, felt really nice, but I thought, that's a waste of time for him to go through that. And why can't we do something different with kids in school if we know that's not what's working? Maybe we're not going to do drug prevention in schools, but why are we continuing to waste time? It has been repackaged. It's now called Keeping It Real, which as far as I can tell is pretty much the same thing in a new code. So this idea, well, we saw short-term gains. At the end of this, children were much less likely to say they wanted to use drugs. They were much more horrified about drugs. They felt much more confident they could resist peer pressure. But when we really tracked the long-term outcomes, what we found was not that all kids went on to a life of drug abuse, but that most people were okay and would have been okay without that intervention. They may have experimented with drugs, but fortunately didn't have dire consequences. And the kids that did go on to the more dire consequences had a whole constellation of problems that DARE was simply inadequate to address. We didn't target the high-risk kids, which is one of the principles of the most effective interventions. There's this problem of television and how it's skewed our belief. Everybody's an expert. There's this great book that I recommend everybody called The Death of Expertise by a policy analyst named Tom Nichols, and I can send you the information on that book. But he talks about, because of the internet and because of particularly social media and how people tend to seek out viewpoints on the internet that reinforce pre-existing beliefs, people aren't learning, they're not growing. They're not really finding out ways that our government is good or bad. They're simply going in with their preconceived ideas, talking to people like them in what he calls these echo chambers, and going away with it even more deeply entrenched in their beliefs, right or wrong. And the 24/7 news cycle does the same thing. We no longer, news outlets no longer have to strive for neutrality in order to capture the biggest audience. They go for the niche, and that's who's going to watch it. And then we watch these TV shows which give us some really messed up ideas. It's incredible how inaccurate crime TV is. Anybody watch the show Night Of? It's a really good show. It's a mystery about this kid who wakes up after a night of carousing and drinking and hooking up with a woman and finds her murdered, and then it goes through his trial. It's really well done, has some respected actors on it, very well written. Yet the kid is serving time, and he's doing jail time at Rikers waiting for his trial. Rikers Island is a very famous city in New York City. It's a jail. He would be there pre-trial. However, he interacts with offenders who are doing life sentence for murder. His cellmate is doing life sentence. And I love the show, but it just drove me crazy. I thought, you couldn't have hired one person to explain to you that you don't do life in jail? Nobody's doing life in Rikers. So these TV shows don't work, and this is my idea. We need this TV show, the EBP Files, make it work. And we have these kind of sexy ladies. We could have men. I couldn't find a good meme for that. So we could have men on it. And every week they would take a different evidence-based practice, and they would do a little show about it. And, then it would close with, saying, make it work. Yeah. So one of these days I'm going to make this pitch to Hollywood and watch for that. And then we have stuff like this. These are some actual news headlines. These are the kind of things that make headlines. That's an actual mugshot. We usually see that kind of sullen, angry person. Or And this is the rock star David Bowie. None of this is about David. But we also see celebrities. So celebrity, I think this was an old, the late rock star was arrested for drugs. Celebrity stuff makes the news. They do minor things. Everything else, it's the big stuff. That's what we're seeing. We don't see this. Man is recidivated after being released for 20 years and hasn't recidivated. That's not a headline. We don't know what doesn't happen. Former married man hasn't used drugs. We know when things screw up, which affects that confidence in the system, but we don't hear about what works. We sometimes see this, stuff like, kind of, it has less dramatic effect, and it's usually buried a little more into the news, but programs that may have some sort of intent to help people reintegrate. Sometimes we see things like this, helps reduce recidivism in Iowa, but those aren't the headlines that grab people, those aren't the headlines that propel people, by and large, into thinking about criminal justice policy. They're not the ones that are jumping out. This idea of who owns expertise, you got to be like my generation to appreciate that, but there was a famous commercial in the 70s, you remember this, that was a soap opera doctor who introduced some cough syrup, and he'd say, I'm not a doctor, but I put one on TV. I thought, why did he get a big doctor? Why would we be convinced by a soap opera star? But we were. It was considered a very successful ad campaign. The attractive young doctor telling you the best cough syrup, even though he was an actor. So everybody's an expert, I feel like, on crime. The prosecutor who told my colleagues that it's 100% recidivism. I was having some drinks with some friends after their volleyball game, and one of their teammates started talking again about the topic of sex offenders. And he said, well, I don't like those sex offender registries because it's mostly just people who were like 18 or 19 and they had sex with their 16-year-old girlfriend and their parents called the police. And I said, no, there's a lot of things wrong with those registries, and there are people like that. By and large, it is not the problem that those are overly populated with those people. I said, most of those people are not in the criminal justice system. We don't have to worry too much about that. And he said, oh yeah? My buddy's a cop, and he tells me differently. And my friend said, well, she works with sex offenders, she did this research, and she knows this stuff. And he said, my buddy's a cop, So this idea of who's the experts, police, prosecutors, they're the face of criminal justice. And I wouldn't try to explain to a cop how to conduct a high-speed chase. Or, I can't imagine this guy saying, hey, my buddy's in charge of the sex offender program, and she says you should drive like this when you do it. Yet people are willing to concede to expertise to police, to prosecutors, to judges about what works with people when they know nothing about it. He went on to tell me that, well, if the parents want to press charges, the cop's hands are pretty much tied. There's nothing you can do. And I said, no, that's not even a thing. Pressing charges is not a thing in our criminal justice system, despite the fact I see it in television all the time. Well, do you want to press charges, sir? Well, okay, we can't do anything. Prosecutors press charges. Pressing charges, despite TV and novels, is not a thing. And he said, well, buddy said this, which I think was a misunderstanding, because I think his buddy knew that he wasn't in charge of citizens are not in charge of pressing charges. But this idea of the experts, the researchers being behind the scenes, is tough to get around. It was a long time now. Why don't we move past where we are stuck in these entrenched ideas and listening to the wrong types of expertise? Part of it has to do with the saying my old warden used to use, the metaphor, we're too busy shooting alligators to drain the swamp. What's the alligators in corrections? Overcrowded, underfunded prisons, the political environment, the fact that prisons get who we send them, and if they're sent there on a 20-year sentence, because that's what the politicians, the law they passed, we're stuck with them. Leadership and staff turnover, correctional officer turnover varies by state, but it's usually between 15 and 30% within a year. So as many as a third of your employees, close to a third, can be gone within a year. So trying to really induce an effective climate for change can be tough. And then the swamp this is the stuff we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. This is the stuff we need to clean up. The uneven commitment of staff to do research bad practices, the outright rejection, the failure to understand what we should be doing. And that permeates not just at the correctional officer level, but the level of program managers, caseworkers, probation officers. And then continue to do these things like boot camps, scared straight programs that have been shown to have no effectiveness. That's the swamp. That's the stuff we need to clean up. That one. But here's one of the problems: is research and practitioners are very different in what they want. Back to that. So researchers tend to be academics who have these types of goals. They want to get tenure, they want to get published in peer-reviewed journal, present at professional conferences. These are some titles of what would be in a journal. Can models of organizational change help to understand success and failure community sentence and plan conduct on organizational change and undergird offender management? Would you want to read that? And I'm not calling out, I'm not denigrating, it's a really good article, I read it. Validate the principles of effective intervention and systematic review of the attributions. Does a practitioner, does a caseworker, probation officer want to read that? So I have this little cartoon about precision and significance, and a scientist might say, a 1,500 kilogram mass is approaching your head at 45.3 MIs, as opposed to look out. And we need to talk in simpler language. There's some look out, motivational interviewing, these are straightforward. These are the kind of articles that if it appeared in like a corrections trade magazine, read by probation officers, wardens, etc., people would be inclined to read, would be inclined to learn something about. And this is really what people want to do in the workforce. They're like, I want to keep my job. I don't want to question whether my program is actually evidence-based and whether it's working. They kind of want to maintain the status quo and conserve resources because they're afraid that if they start talking about a different program, it means spending more money, spending more time. Whereas I say the solution is, why not shifting things away from what works? So how do we fix it? Quickly, things like we need to invest more in evaluations and expecting agencies to respond to evaluations. My role often as an evaluator, somebody calls me and says, hey, we got a grant, we got to evaluate the drug court. Can you come out and do this? Can we hire you to come in and do this? And then I give them the report, and years later I may see somebody that I interviewed as part of that and participated in the evaluation, and they'll say, I remember you came out and did that. They'll say, whatever happened with that? And I know that it wasn't shared down the line. It was simply handed off to the grant maker, the people who gave them the money, and said, see, we did an evaluation. Well, we need to close the loop on that. We need to respond. The grant makers need to say, we want to see evidence that you took that and you acted on it, and it changed something. We need to have a process for verifying compliance. Some states have been really progressive. I don't know why it's just the vol states, but Oregon, Ohio, Indiana, and Iowa, I'm sure there's constant states doing things, have all been leaders in actually passing laws saying corrections agencies, you must have at least by next year 25% of your practices and programs fit with what this website that it shows your own is evidence-based. And then 2 years later we want to see 50%. And then 3 years later 75%. Some of that just comes in from the agency directors. They don't require the mandate, they're saying we're just going to do it anyway. We need to see more of that. We need to build support. We need to have more conferences and more publications where researchers talk to practitioners without the statistical models and without these kind of complicated titles, where they appeal to them. It's not rocket science. The people working in the front lines are smart people. We need to be able to convey to them what the research is and what it means to them. And then I like to do just teaching agencies to kind of do their own research. Agencies usually don't have in-house researchers. Most criminal justice agencies, if they do, it's somebody who compiles like an annual report. Say we incarcerated 70,000 people this year, we had approximately 30,000 offenders go home, and so many were white, so many were women, etc. They don't engage in routine program evaluation monitoring. Maybe that has to be mandated legislatively. Maybe it's just better training, increasing the communication of the buy-in. More conferences where researchers and practitioners talk to one another. Academics tend to go to their conferences, researchers tend to go to those. They're not crossing over and really sharing things that's meaningful. And then there's a lot of benefits to universities for this. The sustained relationships with universities and corrections agencies. It provides opportunities for internships and learning for students, and it allows the universities to make an impact on those agencies by committing to a kind of ongoing, we're going to watch what you're doing, we're going to help you improve it. We're not about terminating programs and costing you jobs. We're going to help you do things about that work. Because we know it works. We have that knowledge. So what is it you can do? I think you can, if you are a criminal justice major, if you decide to go into corrections, you can be like the ambassadors among your peers. You can talk about evidence-based practice. I tell my students that. I had a student who, after learning about something called crisis intervention training, which is an evidence-based model to help improve officers' responses to mentally ill people, he sat through a class where I taught a unit, I had a guest speaker, and I said, hey, you guys, if you become police officers, you should go to your chiefs and say, I want to do the CIT program, I want to be that officer. He called me a couple years ago and he said, guess what I'm doing? I'm a CIT officer in Maryland Heights. And I said, hey, that's great. And I said, how'd you get into that? And he said, what are you talking about? You told me to do it. So here I am doing it. So if you go into some line of work where you have an opportunity to tell people about, we know stuff that works, share that. As citizens, vote for support your candidates who talk about getting smart on crime, not getting tough, not getting soft, but who are getting smart on crime. A lot of these conversations are bipartisan, which tends to make people suspicious. Like, well, the Democrats and the Republicans agree, it must be something weird. It's not. It's very pragmatic. So listen for getting smart on crime, pay attention to those candidates, and just as individuals, what you could do. Be open, learn about things, get out of your comfort zone, your own beliefs and philosophies about we got to punish or we got to be caring and empathetic. Pay attention to what really works. Learn what you can about it. Never stop inquiring, never stop learning. The world is always changing. You need to be ready to change with it. So don't stop asking questions. Don't stop opening your mind to these things. Thank you. If you're interested in my slides and some of the material I didn't get through or didn't talk about as much as I'd like, I have a business card or Dr. John, I can share my email with you, and I'm happy just to email you the slides with references and things if it's something you want to learn more about. So, such that. Let me know if you have questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.